Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to talk about one of my favorite science fiction writers, and that's Samuel R. Delany. In particular, I want to focus on his early novel, Babel-17. In part because I reread it this month, and I think this is one of the great entry points into Delany's works, which can be incredibly dense, are stuffed with ideas. Delany is the definition of someone who's a polymath. As a writer, he's always focused on some interesting concept and theme in his novels, and yet he wraps them up into what's very clearly science fiction. Delany gives us magnificent worlds in the near future or the distant future, worlds with humans and what humans could become. And he's fascinated with these ideas and these details. And yet the details on a micro level and on a macro level never get in the way of the narrative. And they never get in the way of the actual theme, the idea in a work that Delany is fascinated in. In Babel-17, it happens to be the concept of language, whether it's human language, language between animals, or language within computers, the nascent era of computer coding. And so this is a great way to experience what Delany can do and accomplish as a writer, as a science fiction writer, as a theorist of the human condition, and yet just enjoy a ripping science fiction novel as well. It was published in the middle of the 1960s, and in this one we have a character, our main character, Rydra Wong, is a poet, a human poet, who has been tasked to decode Babel-17, this language that seems to be used by these mysterious invaders in their sabotage attacks against the Earth Alliance. So to give a sense of how Delany writes, here we go. First of all, General, she was saying, Babel-17 isn't a code. His mind skidded back to the subject and arrived teetering. Not a code, but I thought cryptography had at least established. He stopped because he wasn't sure what cryptography had established. You mean we've just been trying to decipher a lot of nonsense? It's not a code, she repeated. It's a language. The general frowned. Well, whatever you call it, code or language, we still have to figure out what it says. As long as we don't understand it, we're a hell of a way from where we should be. The exhaustion and pressure of the last months homed in his belly, a secret beast to strike the back of his tongue, harshening his words. Her smile had left and both hands were on the counter. He wanted to retract the harshness. She said, "You're not directly connected with the cryptography department." The voice was even, calming. He shook his head. Then let me tell you this. Basically, General Forrester, there are two types of codes. In the first, letters or symbols that stand for letters are shuffled and jiggled according to a pattern. In the second, letters, words, or groups of words are replaced by either letters, symbols, or words. A code can be one type or the other, or a combination, but both have this in common. Once you find the key, you just plug it in and out come logical sentences. A language, however, has its own internal logic, its own grammar, its own way of putting thoughts together with words that span various spectra of meaning. There is no key you can plug in to unlock the exact meaning. At best, you can get a close approximation. Do you mean that Babel-17 decodes into some other language? Not at all. That's the first thing I checked. We can take a probability scan on various elements and see if they are congruent with other language patterns, even if these elements are in the wrong order. No, Babel-17 is a language itself, which we do not understand. And within that, Delany goes on to explore. He mentions concepts around linear B and Hittite and languages that we know from ancient times and how these could be deciphered. Later on, he talks about his own phrasing for binary, on-off, the idea of ones and zeros, two states. And so there are all these really fascinating ideas around language that Delany's interested in here in the book. And yet, he's using the vehicle, the medium of science fiction to explore this idea. He gives us a world that is strange. It's familiar in ways, but it's strange. And so this next passage is as they go in, it's around page 30, as they head into a bar. And this was published in the middle of the 1960s, and some, including Delany himself, have described the bar scene, the wrestling scene here in Babel-17 as one of the inspirations, direct or indirect, for the famous cantina scene in episode 4 of Star Wars: A New Hope. So let's get a sense of that. They waited for the monorail nearly 6 minutes. When they came down, the streets were smaller, and a continuous whine of transport ships fell across the sky. Warehouses and repair and supply shops sandwiched rickety apartments and rooming houses. A larger street cut past, rumbling with traffic, busy loaders, stellarmen. They passed neon entertainments, restaurants of many worlds, bars and brothels. In the crush, the customs officer pulled his shoulders in, walking more quickly to keep up with Ryder's long-legged stride. Where do you intend to find my pilot? That's who I wanted to pick up first. She stopped on the corner, shoved her hands into the pockets of her leather pants, and looked around. Do you have someone in mind? I'm thinking of several people. This way. They turned on a narrower street, more cluttered, more brightly lit. Where are we going? Do you know this section? But she laughed, slipped her arm through his, and like a dancer leading without pressure, she turned him toward an iron stairway. In here. Have you ever been to this place before? She asked with an innocent eagerness that made him feel for a moment he was escorting her. He shook his head. Up from the basement cafe, black burst, a man, ebony skinned, with red and green jewels set into his chest, face, arms, and thighs. Moist membranes, also jeweled, fell from his arms, billowing on slender tines as he hurried up the steps. And so we go into this bar. They entered the cafe on a ramp that swerved above the heads of the customers drinking at bar and table 30 foot below. Above and to the side of them, a 50-foot sphere hovered like smoke under spotlights. Ryder looked from the globe to the customs officer. They haven't started the games yet. Is this where they hold those fights? That's right. But that's supposed to be illegal. They never passed the bill. After they debated it, it got shelved. Oh. As they descended among the jovial transport workers, the officer blinked. Most were ordinary men and women, but the results of cosmetic surgery were numerous enough to keep his eyes leaping. I've never been in a place like this before, he whispered. Amphibians or reptilian creatures argued and laughed with griffins and metallic-skinned sphinxes. And so this scene continues, and within it we start to see Delaney's ability to, in a sense, shift our perceptions of what could humanity become in the future. Will we become monolithic, a la Orwell? Or will there be these extremes, these differences, where the fringes flourish, in a sense? And what could that look like? Throughout this, there's always this idea of human potential, this idea that we have not yet fulfilled our potential. There are more frontiers to explore, both externally, within space, within an expanse, mentally, within what we can, accomplish with technology, with our own self-perceptions, but also these aspects of intrinsic humanity that are going to expand and shift in new ways. And Delaney's always pushing forward with what that could be. And it's present here in Babel-17 right from the beginning as a writer. And it's something that I think makes this book a real pleasure to read. It's fascinating to see how he explores themes, how he explores ideas. But it's always through this lens of science fiction that's exciting. He's building out a world and an expansive world, a galaxy, multiple galaxies that are at war. And yet that never gets in the way of the characters. It never gets in the way of the theme that he's really fascinated with within Babel-17. That's something that I think many writers struggle with. They want to create these expansive worlds and just explain everything and connect all the dots for us. Delaney trusts that his readers are smart enough to imagine and to use what he's given them to flesh out a canvas to imagine this world in. And yet to return to the ideas that he is interested in. In this case, it's language. And it's interesting how he explores the ideas of paradoxes. How do you confuse a computer? What happens if you remove just a couple of words from a language or a grammar? How would that completely shift the society that uses that grammar, that uses that language? And what are the crucial words? In a way, Delaney is advancing on ideas that writers like James Joyce or Samuel Beckett had built, and yet he's doing it through this perspective of science fiction that I think is really fascinating, and it makes him a writer to pay attention to. So if you've never read Delaney, this is one of the books I would recommend exploring. I would also recommend Nova, which I believe was the novel he wrote right after this in like 1968. And that's a book that's a bit more of a space adventure, and yet has, again, just wonderful ideas to explore. It's why I read and reread Delaney. Before this, he had written The Ballad of Beta 2, which is an interesting novella in which he's exploring this idea of how do we construct myth, What would it look like for an advanced spacefaring civilization to try and construct myth? And it's interesting to read this book or to read Babel-17 in comparison with a work like A Rose for Ecclesiastes from Roger Zelazny, where the idea of science fiction and myth collide to very different intents, very different purposes. Delaney would go on, of course, to write the magnificent Dhalgren, a much more explicit Joycean work, drawing on like Finnegan's Wake. And the density of his language is just incredible. Later on, Triton, where the great theme in Triton is, of course, gender. And throughout, we start to sense the way that Delaney's perspective relies on his queer identity, both in as early as Babel-17, but here in Triton very, very firmly. Later on, of course, we would have the Einstein intersection, Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, a much later work from Delaney. But someone who's really very accomplished as a writer. He's also collected in Dangerous Visions. He has one of the last, possibly the last, if I recall correctly, story in here. Yeah, he has the very last story in here, I and Gomorrah. And honestly, it's one of the very best. Sort of this idea of what happens to, again, outsiders who are viewed as sort of like freaks by normal society and who are fascinated by these freaks within society, and the way Delaney crafts that perspective very, very quickly and briefly, and yet so thoroughly. His combination of building out worlds with such economical language is really incredible. Then, as I had mentioned, the ideas around myth that Delaney is interested in, the ideas around sort of the human condition that he's interested in, really remind me of what Thomas Mann was doing with Joseph and His Brothers, or The Magic Mountain. With Joseph and His Brothers, it's very firmly this like modernism colliding with the concepts of myth and spirituality, and Delaney, I think, is on that level. It'd be, if you took Thomas Mann and had him writing science fiction 2 generations later, you'd have someone like Delaney. I had already mentioned Joyce and the interplay with language, the experiments in a sense. Babel-17 is an experiment with language, as, I won't spoil it, but Babel-18 develops into. A contemporary of Delaney's would be Thomas Pynchon, and I think, you know, something like Dhalgren belongs side by side with Gravity's Rainbow. The density of what they're both getting at and exploring, and the way that one has to just surrender to the questions and the language and the waterfall of the novel is something that's meant to be experienced. I mentioned Beckett as well. I think the way that Beckett explores perspective is something Delaney's doing in each of his passages, each of the parts of the novel, Babel-17. He has a separate narrator he focuses on that illuminates some new perspective around the central character, Ryder Wong, the poet who's, you know, learning the language of Babel-17, or other key characters who are introduced. Similarly, I think a writer like Italo Calvino, whether it's in Invisible Cities or Cosmic Comics T0, someone who is really interested in exploring ideas, but it's through some venue, some vein of fiction, whether it's science fiction or mainstream fiction or whatever. Finally, another, you know, writer who's sort of science fiction adjacent would be Haruki Murakami, or Murakami Haruki, particularly I think in Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World, who's getting into the mind and exploring these things, but it's through the lens of this very strange sort of sideways look at our world. In terms of explicit science fiction, I think another writer who produces interesting works that are perhaps a bit more on the space opera side of science fiction and yet have ideas would be C.J. Cherryh. Downbelow Station is her like blockbuster novel. Delaney's Nova can also be found in the Library of America's science fiction from the 60s, the second volume, the 68-69 one. This also has The Great Picnic on Paradise by Joanna Russ, a contemporary of Delaney's, who really introduced sort of a feminist perspective in science fiction while writing just incredible science fiction as well. And it's interesting to see how they're operating alongside writers like Jack Vance, Roger Zelazny, Clifford Simic, or Poul Anderson and Frederick Pohl, like writers like those. The other science fiction writer who I think really stands like shoulder to shoulder with Delaney in terms of bringing in some perspective that's grounded in research and study would be Ursula Le Guin. Her familial background in anthropology is very evident in works like Always Coming Home. Even in the Hainish novels, the way she's constantly exploring some idea, whether it's an idea of a totalitarian state, whether it's an idea of colonialism and imperialism, whether it's an idea around gender or in The Left Hand of Darkness, or the concept of myth in Rocannon's world. She's someone who, again, is constantly building out what does it mean to be human by asking questions about what would happen if we changed this one thing and introduced this one idea, and what does that tell us about ourselves and our world. So let me know if you've ever read any Delaney. I'm a big fan, and I'll be reading and rereading him for the rest of my life. So I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.